Okay, I figured I'd make a little video here on the Traxxas TRX3. I'm going to talk about modern hex wheel conversions for the TRX3, and this would also apply to the RAD2 or the TRX1. You would use essentially the same strategy here. So basically, you know, I'm thinking of running this Traxxas TRX3 either for the Vintage Off-Road Nationals or for a silver can class at one of my racetracks where they do like a sort of semi-vintage rear motor silver can class on Friday nights. Whether or not I can actually attend is another story, but I'd like to set up a few cars for that. This is one candidate. Thing is, all my AstroTurf stuff is Kyosho, and so I'd like to be able to just swap between my Kyosho wheels and tires for as many of my cars as I have, including, for example, this one. And again, even if I take this to the Vintage Nationals, I got plenty of Kyosho tires with the tires I would use at RAC Excitement. I'd like to be able to use them on this, so I don't have to buy new wheels and tires specific to this chassis. Anyway, what did I do? So the front part is relatively simple. What some people have done to do a front hex conversion on the TRX3 is to actually change the hub carriers and the spindle carriers. So one of my friends, I think he used a Traxxas Bandit front caster block and spindle carrier because those more modern Traxxas spindle carriers have, I think I have an example here. Let me see if I can pull it up. Yeah, like this here, right here. So this is actually a pretty simple setup because you have you know, two bearings on either side. And then this little wheel axle here just slots through and it has a pin. Then you put a wheel hex on the pin and then boom, you're done. The thing is, when I tried that trick using Traxxas Bandit caster blocks mating to those Traxxas Bandit spindle carriers, it doesn't quite fit on these arms. So you might have to modify that part a little bit to get it to fit right. So when you compress the suspension, it doesn't bind up anywhere. So all I did is I just kept the stock caster blocks and spindle carriers, and I got these GPM wheel hexes. So what this is a wheel hex with inserts to fit a 4x8 bearing. Or rather, I should say, a bearing with an 8mm outer diameter. And you can use flanged bearings or unflanged bearings. The wheel axle that goes onto the front spindle carrier here is a 5mm. So all you have to do is get those wheel hexes and 5x8 unflanged wheel bearings, because the flanges take up some space. Okay, get the unflanged wheel bearing, you mount that in, and that'll give you enough room on the thread to put a thrust bearing. So this is a 5x10mm thrust bearing. So you put that on, and then you just get your 5mm lock nut and you put it on backwards. So the nylon locking piece is on the inside, and you just tighten it down. And you don't crank all the way, because then it'll lock this whole thing up, because you'll bind up the thrust bearing. But you screw it in just enough so that you get free movement, but you also don't get any wobbling of the wheel against this hex. Because if you just put the hex on and the wheel, and then you put the lock nut on, now you have to space this lock nut against the wheel so that the wheel doesn't rub against the lock nut and bind. But then by having that spacing, the wheel's going to wobble. So the thrust bearing allows you to pick up all that slack to keep this thing from wobbling. I mean, this wobbles because there's play in the suspension. To keep this from wobbling against the wheel hex while also getting free movement. Okay, so pretty simple. And then on the rear, what did I do? I basically went to use Kyosho parts. So what you can do here is the outdrive that you would normally attach to the gearbox here is kind of like these old Kyosho outdrives, where the actual diff itself has a shaft with a little flat spot on it, actually one on either side of the shaft, and then you use set screws to mount these diff outdrives to either side of the output shaft, and then you have these coaxial dog bones, the old Traxxas style coaxial dog bones that go out to the hub carrier to the wheel axle. So these Kyosho units, you would see these on any vintage Kyosho car. You know, it could be like the Triumph, the Pro X, the Pro XRT, the old Lazers, all of them, they use this kind of diff out drive. Now it only has one grub screw on one side, it's not on both sides, but still, it actually slots right on. The inner diameter is perfect, it's a perfect fit onto this Traxxas output shaft that comes out of the diff. They both use metric parts, and then you just use that set screw, crank it in there on the flat spot on the output shaft, and there you go. And then you can take any type of, you know, your metric CVAs or CVDs and mount them on. So you don't need to find like a vintage MIP CVD kit for the Traxxas TRX3, which is not only impossible to find but probably ludicrously expensive if you do find one. You could just do this, and you would use here the 62.5mm dog bone, and the wheel axle would be the 3-ring wheel axle. I forget the part number, but that's the widest wheel axle. And you would put a couple of shims on the inside here, so that way the drive pin that you would put the wheel hex onto is, you know, close or very close to the outer bearing on the hub carrier. Okay, and at full droop you get plenty of room there between the dog bone pin and the edge of the diff out drive, so these are not going to pop out. And at full compression you don't get this dog bone, you know, slamming into the inside of the out drive. I did try briefly the newer style RB7SS 64mm dog bone, so it's 1.5mm longer, and with using this and then taking out the shims that I had in here, and although, you know, this mates just fine to the actual diff out drive, it is a little bit too long. At full compression it's going to bind here, and it also forces you to use, because this is longer and you're not using shims, instead of that 3-ring wheel axle you'd have to pull it down to like a 2-ring wheel axle to pull the drive pin hole back in. So I just went with the older style 62.5 with the shims and the 3-ring wheel axle, because again, this is too long. Even with no shims on the inside here, this is too long anyway. So there you go, and you have a CVA conversion for the TRX3, and then the actual wheel hex that you would use would be a 10mm wide wheel hex. So you pop that on there, and then you know, there's not quite a whole lot of thread left on the wheel axle when all is said and done, so you have to use a serrated nut instead of a lock nut. I do that on several of my cars where I do these kind of hex conversions, and it mounts just fine. And then if we take this over to some kind of a platform here just to check the widths, to make sure the front and rear widths are the same. You know, there's no funny business with the rear being like too narrow or too wide compared to the front. It's fairly equal front to rear, so it looks like the geometry is about right, and you can run modern rims, hex rims. It spins freely, no binding issues, no nothing. So this is what I plan to use on the TRX3 if I ever do get this running. And there you go. I just figured I'd share that with you guys for any of you that have an old Traxxas buggy. Okay, thanks for watching.